What if one of the oldest spiritual traditions on earth has no founder? No prophet who heard a voice in the desert, no single holy book to argue over, no founding moment you can circle on a calendar. What if the faith was built not on commandments carved into stone, but on the quiet, unseen pulse of nature itself? The rushing of a river, the silence of an old forest, the weight of a mountain against the sky. That faith exists. The Japanese call it Shinto, which means, roughly, the way of the gods. And the deeper you go into its history, the stranger that history becomes. Because the thing most people believe about it turns out to be only half true. Begin in a cedar forest. The air is cold and thick with the smell of wet bark and moss. Somewhere ahead, hidden among the trees, stands a simple wooden gate. 2 upright posts, 2 crossbeams resting on top, no walls, no door, nothing to keep anyone out. This is a Torii, and crossing beneath it is meant to mark a threshold, the line between the ordinary world you came from and a space considered sacred. Step through, and you have left the loud and the mundane behind. The Japanese roadmap marks every shrine in the country with a tiny icon of this exact shape. There is something worth noticing right at the start. The word Torii means, in its oldest sense, a place where birds perch. And in ancient Japanese belief, birds carried an association with death, with funeral rites. Yet death, in this tradition, brings a kind of spiritual pollution called kegare. So the gate keeps the name and loses the birds. No carving of a bird survives on the torii you walk under today. The contradiction is left standing in plain sight, a small mystery the religion never bothered to resolve. Now, the standard story is that Shinto is among the most ancient religions in the world, stretching back into the unwritten past of the Japanese islands. Here is what that story gets right, and here is what it leaves out. The reverence for nature is genuinely old. According to the historians who study this, the veneration of sacred powers in the landscape can be traced back to the Yayoi period, roughly 300 years before the Common Era, when rice farming spread across the archipelago and a kind of nature worship grew alongside the rhythm of planting and harvest. Before that, in the long Jomon period of hunter-gatherers, the people almost certainly held spiritual beliefs tied to the natural world, but they left no writing, so we are reading shadows. What is missing from the simple version is this. The religion we now call Shinto, with its clear boundaries and its sense of being distinct from everything around it, that came much later. The very word Shinto first appears in writing in the Nihon Shoki, a chronicle completed in the year 720, and even there it was used mainly to tell native customs apart from the newly arrived Buddhism. For most of Japanese history, the worship of these nature spirits was tangled together with Buddhist practice so thoroughly that pulling them apart would have made no sense to the people living it. The historian Toshio Kuroda, in an article published in 1981 that reshaped the entire field, argued that Shinto, as a separate, independent religion, is largely a modern construction, an idea projected backward onto a past that did not quite contain it. So which is it, ancient or invented? The way I read this, the honest answer is both. And the tension between those two truths is the real story. Here's what most accounts get wrong. They treat that as a flaw in the record, a puzzle to be solved. It is not a flaw. It is the religion's defining feature. The hillside shrines are old. The forests were sacred long before anyone wrote a word about them. But the tidy religion you can look up in an encyclopedia was assembled, argued over, and politically shaped across many centuries. Look at the pattern and you will see it repeat. What feels eternal was usually built by human hands somewhere along the way. And what strikes me most is that this did not weaken the tradition. It is precisely what let it survive. At the heart of it all sits a single idea, and it is unlike almost anything in the religions that grew up around the Mediterranean. The Japanese call the sacred powers kami. There is no clean English translation. A kami is not a god seated on a throne handing down laws. It is a presence, something that inspires awe or fear or a sense of mystery. A waterfall can be kami, a strangely shaped rock, an ancient twisted tree, a mountain, a storm, the spirit of an ancestor or of a person who did something extraordinary in life. The old phrase for all of them together is Yaoyorozu no Kami, the 8 million gods. According to the texts, that number is not a census. 8 is a lucky number, and 8 million simply means countless, beyond counting, everywhere. Here's what I find striking about that. These kami are not divided into good and evil. A kami is not kind or cruel by nature, it is powerful. The same spirit that blesses a harvest can wither it. Treat it with respect and it protects. Neglect it, offend it, and it can turn. What decides the outcome is not the kami's character, it is the relationship. That single idea quietly rearranges everything. There is no cosmic war between light and darkness here, no final judgment, no original sin staining every newborn. There is only purity and pollution, kegare, the spiritual grime that comes from death and decay and disorder, which can be washed away with clean water and a sincere heart. Notice what that does to the whole shape of the religion. Sin, in the Western sense, is something you are. Kegare is something that happens to you, and something you can rinse off. The entire apparatus of Shinto practice flows from that. The basin of water at the shrine gate, where you cleanse your hands and mouth before approaching. The priests who fast and bathe before a ceremony. The festivals timed to the turning of the seasons and the cycle of the rice fields. Spring, a prayer for a good harvest. Autumn, gratitude that it came. This is not a faith of doctrine, it is a faith of doing. You might think this is ancient history, sealed off behind glass. It is not. There are something like 80,000 shrines in Japan today, and that counts only the ones with a resident priest. Include the small ones, the shrines by the roadside, the miniature altars on the roofs of office buildings, the household shelf where a family leaves an offering, and the number roughly doubles. Many traditional Japanese homes still keep 2 altars side by side, one for the kami, one in the Buddhist style for the ancestors, 2 traditions that would, much later, be forced apart by law, still sharing a single roof. The thread running through all of it has never really broken. And that brings us back to the question we started with. How does a religion with no founder, no prophet, no central book of rules, and no single authority survive for thousands of years? Most faiths cling to a fixed text and a clear chain of command precisely because those things hold a religion together against time. Shinto had almost none of that. By every reasonable measure, it should have dissolved or been absorbed or simply forgotten. Instead, it did the opposite. It bent, it borrowed. It absorbed what came at it and kept moving, like water finding the low ground. The question nobody asks is whether that was a weakness at all. There is a deeper truth at work here, and it is one we tend to resist. That the things which look like weakness, having no founder to martyr, no scripture to burn, no headquarters to conquer, can be exactly what makes a thing impossible to kill. You cannot behead a religion that has no head. You cannot ban a book that was never written. That same quality, the gentle, formless, decentralized reverence for the spirits of the water and the wind, is also, and this is the part that should stay with you, what made it possible for the Japanese state, in a later and far more dangerous century, to take this quiet woodland faith and forge it into the engine of an empire. The same softness that let Shinto survive is the softness that let it be picked up and aimed. How a religion of mountains and rivers became a religion of conquest is not a contradiction. It is the same trait, turned to a different purpose. And to understand how that happened, you first have to understand the spirits themselves, all 8 million of them.
Wet earth, the cold weight of river water against bare ankles, the faint green smell of rice shoots pushed into a flooded paddy under a low grey sky. This is the world where it begins. Not in a temple, not in a council of priests, but in a field, with mud on someone's hands and a prayer half-formed on their lips. The prayer is simple. Let the water come. Let the harvest hold. Do not let the river rise and take it all away. For thousands of years, that was the whole of it. No scripture, no creed. Just people standing at the edge of forces far larger than themselves, trying to stay on the right side of them. To find the roots of this, you have to go back further than writing itself. Back into the long prehistory of the Japanese islands, to a people we call the Jomon, hunter-gatherers who left behind pottery marked with the pressed pattern of rope and almost nothing else we can read. They had no books. What spiritual life they held, we glimpse only through objects pulled from the ground. We are reading shadows on a wall, and we should be honest about that. Then, roughly 300 years before the Common Era, the world of those islands changed. A new way of living arrived, carried by people crossing from the Korean peninsula, and with them came rice. Wet rice farming, the kind that needs flooded fields and careful water and the cooperation of an entire village. This was the Yayoi period, and according to the historians who study Japan's earliest religion, it is here that we can first trace the worship that would eventually become Shinto. A reverence built directly on the rhythm of the rice. The belief at its core was this, that nature and the sacred powers were one and the same, and that if you honored them, they might spare you the flood, the drought, the failed crop that meant a winter of hunger. Those sacred powers had a name, Kami. And to understand Shinto at all, you have to sit with how strange and how vast that idea is. A kami is not a god in any sense a Western mind reaches for first. It is a presence, anything that stops you in your tracks with a sense of awe or power or mystery. A mountain that dominates the horizon, a waterfall thundering into a pool, a tree so old and so twisted it seems to be watching you. The first light of the sun, the spirit of a grandfather, or of someone who did something so remarkable in life that death did not end their significance. The old phrase gathers all of them together. Yao Yorozu no Kami, the 8 million gods. But here's what the number really means. It is not a count. 8 is a number of luck and fullness in the cultures of that region, and 8 million is simply a way of saying countless, beyond reckoning, present in everything,
everywhere you turn. There was no central pantheon you could memorize, no holy roster. There was just the conviction that the divine was not somewhere above the world looking down. It was inside the world, soaked into it, as close as the rock under your foot. Now, look at the pattern this creates, because it sets Shinto apart from almost every faith that grew up around the Mediterranean. The kami are not divided into the good and the wicked. A kami is not benevolent or cruel by its nature, it is powerful. The same spirit that fills the rice with life can let it rot in the field. The same sea that feeds a village can swallow its boats. What decides which face the kami shows you is not the spirit's morality, it is your relationship with it. Honor it, keep it clean, approach it with sincerity, and it protects. Offend it, neglect it, pollute its space, and it turns. And that word, pollute, is the key to everything that follows. In this tradition, there is no original sin. There is no stain you are born carrying, no fault built into the human soul that must be redeemed. What strikes me most about Shinto is how completely it sidesteps that entire idea. Instead of sin, there is kegare, spiritual pollution, a kind of grime that gathers on a person through contact with death, with decay, with disorder and illness. And the crucial thing about kegare is this: it is not who you are. It is something that lands on you. Notice what that quietly removes from the entire religion, the burden of guilt, the sense that the self is fundamentally flawed. Which means it can be washed off. So the whole machinery of the religion flows from water. At the entrance to every shrine sits a basin where you rinse your hands and your mouth before you dare approach the sacred. Priests fast and bathe before performing the most important rites, withdrawing into purification, scrubbing the world off themselves so they can stand before the kami clean. There is a fuller version of this, called misogi, where a person stands beneath a freezing waterfall or wades into the cold sea to be purified entirely. The way I read this, it tells you something profound about how these people understood the human condition. You are not broken, you just get dirty, and dirt can be rinsed away. There is one more piece to the world of Part 2, and it is the piece that nearly changed everything. Because around the middle of the 6th century, something foreign arrived on Japanese shores, something with founders, with scriptures, with temples and doctrines, and a fully formed philosophy of the soul: Buddhism. It came across the water from the Korean peninsula, from the kingdom of Paekche, whose envoys, according to the chronicles, presented sutras and images to the Yamato court. The traditional date recorded in the Nihon Shoki is the year 552, though some evidence points to a little earlier, around 538. Here is the question that decides a civilization. When a powerful new religion arrives, what does the old one do? History is crowded with the answer, and it is almost always the same answer: war. The new faith and the old faith fight, and one of them is buried. We've seen this happen on nearly every continent. Conversion by the sword, temples torn down, and churches razed on the rubble. Shinto did something else. Something that, if you ask me, is one of the most remarkable moves in religious history. It did not fight Buddhism, it absorbed it. There was friction at first. One powerful clan, the Soga, embraced the new faith, while another, the Mononobe, resisted it and blamed it for plague and misfortune. But the resolution was not extermination. It was a slow, strange merging. Over the centuries that followed, the kami and the Buddhas were woven together into a single religious world so tightly that for most people living inside it, telling them apart would have made no sense at all. There is even a name for this fusion: Shinbutsu Shugo, the syncretism of kami and Buddhas. And it remained the main organized religion of Japan for more than 1,000 years. By the 9th century, scholars had built an elegant theory to explain the merger. They called it Honji Suijaku. The idea was that the kami of Japan were not rivals to the Buddhas at all, but local appearances of them. Traces, manifestations, the same universal truth showing a Japanese face. The Buddha was the original form. The kami was the trace it left in this particular land. You might think this kind of blending would have diluted Shinto into nothing, dissolved it into the larger, more sophisticated foreign system. The deeper truth is the opposite. By refusing to fight, by bending instead of breaking, the worship of the kami guaranteed its own survival. It did not have to win, it only had to remain. The two traditions never fully fused. They kept their own identity, overlapping here, separate there, in a relationship that was complicated and never quite settled. But they lived together. For more than 1,000 years, a Japanese family could light incense for the Buddha and leave an offering for the kami under the same roof and feel no contradiction at all. It was a quiet harmony, a decentralized reverence spread across countless shrines and villages and forests, with no central authority, no single book, no army of the faith. Soft, formless, durable as water. It had survived the arrival of a rival that should have erased it, but softness has a second face. The same quality that let the kami survive Buddhism, that willingness to be absorbed, to serve a larger purpose, to bend toward whatever power arrived at the shrine gate, was a door that could be opened from the other side. And in the late 19th century, the aggressive modern world came to Japan's shores. The gentle spirits of the water and the wind were about to be handed a uniform. The bronze bell came down from the temple tower with a sound like a wound. Men with ropes and iron bars had been working since dawn, and now the great bell lay in the dirt of the courtyard, waiting for the furnace. It would not ring again. It would be melted, recast, and poured into the mould of a cannon. In the year 1868, across the islands of Japan, this scene repeated itself in 1,000 places. Statues of the Buddha pulled from their altars, scriptures burned, monks ordered to cut their robes and take up new lives or new faith, or simply disappear. In some provinces, according to the historians who have studied this period, 8 out of every 10 temples were torn down. In one domain, in the west of the country, Buddhist temples practically ceased to exist. What was happening was not a riot, it was a policy. And to understand why a nation would suddenly turn on a religion it had practiced for over 1,000 years, you have to understand what Japan was afraid of. For 2.5 centuries, Japan had sealed itself off from the world. Then the world arrived anyway, in the form of foreign warships and treaties signed under the shadow of foreign guns. The leaders who seized power in 1868, in the upheaval we now call the Meiji Restoration, looked around the globe and saw a brutal truth. The nations that did not modernize were being carved up, and colonized. China was being humiliated. India had been swallowed whole. Japan, they decided, would not share that fate. It would industrialize at terrifying speed, build an army and a navy on the Western model, and transform itself from a feudal patchwork of samurai domains into a single, unified, modern state.
But a modern state needs more than factories and rifles. It needs a soul. It needs a story that binds millions of strangers into one people, willing to live and die for something larger than their village. The Western powers had such a story, woven through with Christianity. Japan would need its own, and the men of the Meiji government found it in the oldest material they had, the worship of the kami, and the ancient myth that the emperor himself descended in an unbroken line from the sun goddess Amaterasu. There was a problem. For more than 1,000 years, the worship of the kami had been fused with Buddhism so completely that you could not separate them. Shrines and temples shared the same grounds. The kami were understood as local appearances of the Buddhas. If Shinto was to become the engine of a new national identity, pure, native, distinctly Japanese, then Buddhism, the foreign import, had to be cut away from it. So in 1868, the government issued the order, the Kami and Buddha's Separation Order. On paper, it was administrative. Buddhist priests were to leave the shrines. Buddhist images were to be removed from Shinto sacred space. The intent, the government would later insist, was only to draw a clean line between the two faiths. But here's what the official record doesn't quite capture. When a state declares that a 1,000-year fusion must be undone, it loses control of the forces it unleashes. What followed was an explosion of violence with a name of its own, Haibutsu Kishaku. Abolish the Buddha, destroy Shakyamuni. The intellectual roots had been growing for generations in a nativist scholarly movement called Kokugaku, which had argued that Japan's true spirit lay in its ancient classics, buried under centuries of foreign Buddhist and Chinese thought. Now that idea had the force of the state behind it. Across the country, mobs and local officials fell on the temples, land was seized, treasures were looted or burned, and those bronze bells went into the furnaces. Look at who benefited from all of this. The destruction was not purely a matter of faith. The domains were short of money, and the temples were rich. They held land, they held wealth accumulated over centuries. Stripping them gave the new government a pretext to take it. Follow the money, and the language of spiritual purity starts to look like a convenient cover for something far more practical. Behind the sacred words, there was, as there so often is, a ledger. The peak of the frenzy lasted from 1868 to around 1873, and then it cooled. The state pulled back its support for the campaign. The separation it had ordered was never actually completed. Even today, many Buddhist temples still keep a small shrine to a guardian kami, and certain Buddhist figures are still honored in Shinto shrines. The 1,000-year marriage could be wounded by decree. It could not be fully annulled. But the deeper project went on. What the government was building had a name historians would later give it, State Shinto. The state took control of shrine finances, it took control of how priests were trained, and it bent the whole apparatus toward a single purpose: the elevation of the emperor from a distant, symbolic figure into something closer to a living god. The old, localized myths, the scattered 8 million kami, were reorganized around one central claim: that the emperor was the divine descendant of Amaterasu, and that to obey him was a sacred duty.
Now, 3 things stand out to me about how this was done. The first is the sleight of hand at the center of it. The government insisted that State Shinto was not a religion at all. It was simply patriotism, civic duty, the historical fact of the emperor's divine origin. This let them compel participation while claiming to respect the freedom of religion they had written into their own constitution. You did not have to believe, you only had to bow. The second is the speed. In the span of a single lifetime, a decentralized folk reverence with no central authority became a tightly controlled instrument of the state. And the third is the direction it pointed. By the 1930s, the shrines were under enormous pressure to focus on the divinity of the emperor, and priests who resisted could face persecution. A faith of rice fields and waterfalls had been turned outward toward conquest. You might think a religion of nature, of purification and seasonal festivals could never become a weapon. The way I read this, that is exactly what made it so usable. Because Shinto had no founder insisting on a fixed doctrine, no single scripture to contradict the state, no central church to push back, it could be reshaped almost without resistance. The same softness that had let it absorb Buddhism 1,000 years earlier now let it be absorbed by the modern state. There was no theological core to say no. And here is the pattern, the one that should give any of us pause. We've seen this before, in other places and other centuries, a government reaching into the deepest, most sincere beliefs of its people and quietly turning them to serve power. History doesn't teach us that the people were foolish to believe. It teaches us how easily a genuine faith, held in good faith, can be picked up by other hands and aimed. The soldier marching off to war believes he is fulfilling a sacred duty. The truth is more complicated, and the men who arranged it knew exactly what they were doing. The shrine called Yasukuni, founded in this era, captured the whole transformation in a single institution. There, the soldiers who died for Japan were enshrined as glorious spirits, their deaths reframed not as loss, but as sacred sacrifice. The kami of the woodland had become the kami of the battlefield. And as the 20th century darkened, that machinery, the divine emperor, the sacred duty, the promise of a hallowed death, helped carry Japan into the most catastrophic war in its history. By 1945, it ended in ash. The cities burned. 2 of them vanished beneath a kind of fire no one had ever seen. The empire that had wrapped itself in the mantle of the sun goddess lay in ruins, its armies broken, its people starving, in the wreckage of a holy mission that had failed. The political weapon of State Shinto had run its course, all the way to the end of the road it had always been heading toward. Which leaves a question hanging in the smoke. The empire was finished. The state that had drafted the gods into its service was about to be dismantled by foreign hands. But the kami themselves, the spirits of the mountains and the rivers, older than any emperor, older than the written word, those had never truly belonged to the empire at all. The question was whether anyone would remember that once the ashes settled, and whether anything of the old, quiet faith could survive the death of the thing it had been forced to become. There is a document, dated the 1st day of January 1946, a New Year's message from the Emperor of Japan to his people, issued in the wreckage of a lost war. The world would come to call it the Humanity Declaration. And for 80 years, most people have believed they know what it says, that on that day, the Emperor stood before his nation and confessed that he was not a god after all. A living deity descended from the sun goddess, admitting at last that he was only a man. That is the story. It is also, when you actually read the words, not quite true. And the gap between what the document said and what the world decided it said, is where the final chapter of this story lives. To stand in that moment, you have to feel how far Japan had fallen. A few months earlier, in the middle of August 1945, the same emperor had spoken to his people for the first time in their lives, not in this written rescript, but over the radio, his voice thin and formal, announcing that the war was over. That broadcast came after 2 cities had vanished beneath atomic fire, and the Soviet army had poured across the northern border. The empire that had marched under the banner of the sun goddess was finished. The holy mission had ended in ash and starvation. Into that ruin came the occupying power, the United States, and a single towering figure who would shape what Japan became: General Douglas MacArthur. He and his staff faced a delicate, dangerous problem. The ideology of State Shinto, the divine emperor, the sacred duty to die for him, the belief that the Japanese were a chosen people destined to rule, that machinery had helped carry the nation into catastrophe. It had to be dismantled. But the emperor himself was another matter. So in December of 1945, the occupation issued an order of extraordinary reach. It is known as the Shinto Directive, and it remains a primary document anyone can read today. With it, the American authorities abolished State Shinto as an arm of the government. No more public money for the shrines, no more compulsory worship in the schools, no more spreading of ultranationalist doctrine through the machinery of religion. What strikes me about that directive is its precision. It banned 3 specific claims: that the emperor was superior because of his descent from Amaterasu, that the Japanese were a superior people, and that their islands were a superior land. In a single stroke, the fusion of throne and shrine that the Meiji government had spent decades constructing was severed. The state let go of the gods. And then, 2 weeks later, came the New Year's rescript, the Humanity Declaration. Here is where you have to read carefully, because the popular version and the actual text part ways. According to the Western reading, the one General MacArthur welcomed and broadcast to the world, the emperor had renounced his divinity. He had publicly admitted he was not a living god, clearing the path for a democratic Japan. But look at what the document actually denied. The emperor rejected one specific term, a particular word for a god in human form. He did not, in plain language, deny that he descended from Amaterasu. And here's what most accounts leave out entirely. In private, around this very time, the emperor told one of his own chamberlains something revealing. He said it was acceptable to call false the idea that the Japanese people were descended from the gods, but that it was absolutely impermissible to call the emperor's own descent from the gods a fantasy. He gave up the people's divinity. He held on to his own. The way I read this, the Humanity Declaration was less a confession than a carefully negotiated retreat. The Western world needed to hear that the God Emperor was gone, and so it heard exactly that. The Japanese court needed to preserve the thread of imperial continuity, and so the words were chosen to leave that thread just barely intact. Both sides walked away believing they had won, and the emperor himself was never put on trial. MacArthur made the calculated decision to keep him on as a symbol, judging that a cooperative emperor would make the occupation far smoother than a martyred one. We've seen this kind of arrangement before in the aftermath of other wars, the victor preserving the very figure he has just defeated, because a familiar throne is easier to govern through than an empty one. The degree to which the emperor himself bore responsibility for the war remains a matter historians debate to this day. What is not debated is that the system which had raised him to godhood demanded absolute obedience from everyone beneath him. So what does that tell us about the death of State Shinto? Notice what had actually happened. The political weapon was destroyed. The legal apparatus that had drafted the kami into the service of empire was dismantled by foreign hands, and it would not be rebuilt. A new constitution would soon reduce the emperor to a symbol of the state and the unity of the people. No longer sovereign, no longer divine in any official sense. The thing the Meiji government had built was gone. But the kami were never the empires to begin with. The question nobody thought to ask, in the rush to dismantle a dangerous ideology, was whether the gods could be destroyed along with the state that had used them. And this is the quiet miracle at the heart of the whole story. Strip away the state, strip away the divine emperor and the war shrines and the compulsory bowing, and underneath it all, the old faith was still there, exactly because it had never really been about any of that. It returned, almost without anyone deciding it should, to the place it had always lived. It returned to the local festivals, the matsuri, timed to the turning of the seasons and the cycle of the rice, as they had been for 2,000 years. In spring, the prayers for a good harvest. In autumn, the gratitude that it came. It returned to the small shrine at the end of the street, to the basin of water where you rinse your hands before you approach, to the household shelf where a family leaves an offering. In 1946, the year the empire's gods were officially dethroned, an organization called Jinja Honcho was formed to care for the shrines now that the state had let go, the 80,000 shrines that still stand across Japan today. And nothing captures the resilience of this faith better than a single, strange ritual at its holiest site. At the grand shrine of Ise, dwelling place of the sun goddess herself, the entire shrine is torn down and rebuilt from scratch every 20 years. It has been done this way since the year 690. The buildings are raised again in cypress wood, joined without a single nail, identical to the ones before. And then the old ones are dismantled, their timbers carried off to other shrines across the country. The Japanese have a word for the idea behind it, tokawaka, eternal youth achieved through renewal. By changing constantly, the shrine never ages. By being rebuilt, it becomes permanent. There's a deeper truth in that ritual, and it is the truth of this entire history. The empire tried to make Shinto into something fixed, monumental, eternal in stone, a divine state that would last forever. And it lasted less than 80 years. The real Shinto survived precisely because it was the opposite of monumental. It was water. It was renewal. It was a thing that could be torn down and quietly rebuilt, again and again, and remain itself. So we come back to where we began, to a faith with no founder, no prophet, no single holy book, that should, by every reasonable measure, have dissolved long ago, and instead outlived the empire that tried to own it. And it leaves us with a question worth carrying out of this story and into our own loud, modern world. We live in an age that hungers for absolute truths and fixed answers, an age that treats the natural world mostly as something to be measured and used and conquered. You might think this is ancient history, a curiosity from a faraway culture with no bearing on your life. But the question it raises is not Japanese, and it is not old. The people who built Shinto believed something stranger, and perhaps something we have forgotten how to feel. that the sacred was not written in any book and not seated on any throne, but breathing in the wind, moving in the water, resting in the soil beneath their feet. They may have been wrong, but before we are certain they were, it is worth asking what it would mean if they were not. What we might be walking past every single day without ever pausing to bow. The candle burns low, the questions don't. Until we meet again, stay curious.